Brown trout have an almost legendary status in the fly fishing world, and for good reason. These are smart, tough, moody fish that can frustrate you to no end. When a brown trout rejects your fly, it feels like a personal rejection of who you are as an angler. Luckily, brown trout aren't impossible to understand. Once you learn about their behavior, their favorite foods, and their preferred hideouts, you'll have a much easier time catching them. On this episode of Untangled, we'll take a deep dive into everything you need to know about brown trout. You'll walk away with some tactics to help you land that big old brown you've always dreamt of.
This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. I hope y'all have your notebooks open, your pencils are sharpened, and you're ready to take notes because class is in freaking session today. And of course, the topic is brown trout. Now, I personally love nerding out about a lot of things in fly fishing. The fish in particular is just fascinating to me. But even if you aren't as inclined to that as I am, there's still a double whammy that we get from looking into these fish as closely as we're going to today. And that is, the more we know about a fish, the better we can become at catching it. So if you wanted to figure out how to catch that big brown or just how to catch more browns, period, then you're going to walk away from today's show with something that will help. And we're going to cover, I hope I didn't forget anything important. So if I did, leave a comment and let me know what I forgot. But I think we've got just about everything you need to know. We're going to start with their history, where they're from, and then we'll talk about where they like to live, the food that they like to eat the most, and then we will really dig into the reputation the Browns have of being tougher to catch than other trout. That's something I remember hearing a lot growing up. As a kid, my dad and my grandpa both fly fished, and I'd hear stories from them about how tough some of those browns were to catch. And I'm sure if you're new to fly fishing, you've heard that too, and you might be curious, what makes the browns so much harder to catch? Is it really that tough to catch, or are we just making excuses for ourselves so we don't feel bad that an animal with the brain the size of like a strawberry outsmarted us? Well, let's dig into it, and let's start out with the history like I mentioned. So, brown trout are actually native to Europe. They're not native to America. They're native to Europe all the way from Norway, Iceland, Sweden, that far north, all the way down through Slovenia, over in the eastern side of Europe. And then they've actually got a tiny sliver of their historical native range in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, which is cool. It makes brown trout native to two separate continents, which is kind of interesting. And they're also the only trout that's native to England as well. They do come in a wide variety of colors. I remember when I first started dating my wife and my mother-in-law was getting to know me a little bit, and I was showing fish pictures because what else are you going to do when you're trying to let your mother-in-law know who you are? You're going to show her fish pictures, right? So I'm showing Laura some fish pictures, and I remember her asking, well, what's this fish? And it's a brown trout. She goes, well, that doesn't look brown. And I mean, she's kind of right, because they do come in a lot of different colors, but they will always have dark spots against a lighter background. Every trout will have that dark spots, light background. But brown trout, often their backs are going to be a dark greenish brown color. Their bellies can be yellowish brown, but sometimes they can even have black backs. They can be really darkly colored. And then other times they'll have these bright red spots all over their flanks, and then they can get these subtle blue hues on their cheeks. I remember I told my wife when we were starting to remodel the house, I wanted to paint one room brown trout blue, which really doesn't make sense when you think about it, but it's that particular shade of blue that they get on their cheeks that I think is just so beautiful. The browns will often get really bright yellow on their bellies and their sides, and that's probably where a lot of the brown trout name comes from. But during spawning season, when they're making more brown trout for us to catch, they can turn bright orange. They can get a lot of red in there, and they get these gnarly hooked jaws called kypes. They kind of look like dinosaurs at that point. And we'll dive into that more a little bit later, but that's just your general overview of what they look like and where they're from. Now, you might have heard brown trout called German browns. I remember hearing that all the time growing up from a lot of the old guys that, oh yeah, I caught this big German brown today. And for a long time, I thought there was a difference between a brown trout and a German brown trout. Well, there's not. It's one name for the same fish. They got that name because the first brown trout that were brought to America in the late 1800s were actually imported from Germany. Their eggs came over from Germany. And again, brown trout are native to German, but those German browns that we got here, they're not really any different or separate or special from brown trout in England or Poland, for example, at least not on a level that we're going to appreciate unless we're fish biologists who understand fish genetics to that level. Now, of course, there are different strains of brown trout. I say all this, the brown trout really aren't all that different, and they're not, but there are different strains of brown trout. And you can think of strains as like almost a different breed of that same species, but it's just not genetically different enough to be an entirely new species itself. An example would be with rainbow trout. They have this as well, where there's different strains like the Kamloops rainbows or the Irwin Sand Creek rainbows, or our Americanized brown trout versus the Seaforellen brown trout, which the Seaforellen brown trout grows larger and lives a little bit longer than other strains of browns, and that's actually the strain that's primarily stocked in the Great Lakes. That's why the Great Lakes have some really nice brown trout if you ever have the opportunity to go out there and catch them. So there are different strains, but German brown, Seaforellen brown trout, they're all still brown trout at the end of the day. Now, like I mentioned, browns came to America in 1883 in particular. There was a New York fish farmer. He wanted to bring some over. His name was Fred Mather, and he imported those eggs from Germany. And then a couple of years later, he got some brown trout eggs from Scotland. And once those were all imported, they were bred together in the hatcheries, and they created this mongrel type brown trout that is mostly what we still have swimming in American rivers today. And the first time that we actually have a record of brown swimming in a river came in 1884 here in America in the Baldwin River in Michigan. So if you've got this desire to go see the ancestral home of brown trout in America, at least, you're going to want to head to the Baldwin River in Michigan. And speaking of Michigan, they actually held the world record for brown trout from 2009 all the way to 2020. There was a 41-pound, 7-ounce brown caught out of the Manistee River there in Michigan, but that was recently beaten. That world record fell in 2020 because a 44-pound, 5-ounce brown was caught in New Zealand, which 2020 New Zealand, that's right smack in the middle of COVID, and the angler caught it by himself, which is very convenient because COVID, you couldn't be out with other people. We've got to take his word for it that it was so much bigger. A little fish story, seems to me. Oh, but speaking of those big browns, something else interesting to talk about real quick too is when there's brown trout in a river, there's almost always a giant brown in that river as well. You'll have a lot of little guys, but there's almost always a really big one, especially for that size of water. An example of this would be I grew up fishing this little spring creek, and it's all brown trout. It used to have some rainbows in it, but it was all browns by the time I was old enough to fish it. And I fished that thing religiously for many years, caught a lot of fish out of it, but never anything really past 14, maybe 15 inches if I'm really stretching that tape measure. Just never caught a very big fish out of it. But my grandpa had mounts of giant browns he'd caught from it on his walls. And then finally, I think it was right before I started college, I was fishing one day, and I come around the bend on the river, and there's this deep hole with a big log stuck in it. And I'm fishing my way through this hole, and I got about halfway up the hole, and I threw a bad cast. I did something that spooked the rest of the fish in the hole, and I just saw this enormous, I'm talking at least 20, to my eyes, it looked 22, 23 inches long and fat. Looked like it had been dining on muskrats or something recently. And this big brown just shoots out from under that log and goes upstream and disappears. But I remember being just blown away that I saw my big brown in the family stream, and my grandpa wasn't full of crap. He'd actually really caught those from the family stream. So that was really cool to see. But that happens when you have these brown trout rivers. There's almost always that really big one. So it's fun to go fish these because you know the possibility of a really big fish is there. And just another story about this. Last fall, Alex and I were fishing river here by my house, and the browns were spawning. They were on their reds, so we weren't bugging them because you don't want to fish to spawning fish. We were just watching for a minute. We were fishing other sections of it away from the spawners, but we were just watching the spawners for a minute. We were curious how big the fish were in there. And there was it was fire engine red almost, just this bright colored up big fish. I'm not sure exactly how big it was, but to my eyes, it looked like it was about 25 inches. And the average fish out of this river is about 13, maybe 14 inches. So again, giant fish, giant browns. When there's browns in a river, there's always a good chance you're going to find a real big one kicking around somewhere. And then speaking of getting really big as well, brown trout can also become anadromous, which means that they migrate out to the ocean to feed where there's a lot more food, but then they come back to spawn in rivers. And some of the biggest browns in the world are sea-run browns in Iceland. I'm sure you've seen some of the YouTube videos about them. They're really cool. Hopefully we make it out there and catch some of those one day and share that experience with you guys. But that should wrap it up for our intro to browns. So now let's take a look at where exactly they prefer to live. Let's get into the stuff that's gonna help us catch them better. So one thing that is really interesting that I've learned just in the last couple of years, I think, is that certain trout really do prefer certain types of water. So you are more likely to catch a certain fish in this type of water in a river. If there's multiple species of fish in a river, you are more likely to catch them in certain areas because they prefer certain types of water. Rainbow trout, for example, love faster water because that's the type of water they evolved in out on the Pacific coast. Very fast, very riffly stuff. They love that. Brown trout, on the other hand, they prefer the slower stuff because a lot of the rivers that they're native to back in Europe are slow. They're deep, they're slow, they're really rich in insect life, a little bit richer than a lot of the freestone rivers that we have here in America, especially out here in the West. But all that being said, brown trout are still opportunistic predators, and you'll catch them in riffles, runs, pools, eddies. You'll get them in all that stuff as well, but the really big ones especially will prefer that slower, deeper type of water. And just in case you don't know what a run, a riffle, a pool, or an eddy is, that's all good. We've got a water types ebook, a Finding Fish ebook that goes over all those different types of water. I'll throw a link to that in the show notes if you want to grab a copy of it for yourself. Something else about browns that's very important to know is that they tend to love structure a lot more than other trout. So they'll hang out near root balls. They'll go in the undercut banks. They'll hang really tight to boulders. They'll get to the bottom of the deeper pools and really just hide themselves away. Generally, they're going to hang out in all the places that you don't want to toss your fly into because there's a really good chance that fly ain't coming back. If you're determined to find a really good brown trout, then you should be fishing these spots. And that probably adds to the sense of accomplishment of catching a brown because the really big ones are in those tough, gnarly spots in the river. And just to give you an example of what exactly that looks like. I was on a river last summer. Alex and I were there right at the height of all the hatches. So we've got bugs buzzing everywhere. It looks beautiful. And we get to this bend in the river with a giant rock in the middle of it that forms this enormous pocket. And I could practically hear some fish sitting in that pocket saying, I'm right here. So I had to figure out how to approach that pocket because it was in the middle of a lot of fast water and it was just out of casting range. And with how fast the water was moving, it would be really tough to get a drift in there with mending because the pocket wasn't big enough for a really long mend. So I had to get close. The rocks were really slippery as I made my way out there. I almost fell a few times as I got into position, but I made it to a spot just below the pocket. I tossed my flies up into it, and then when I see my dry fly dunk under, I set the hook, and this fish, it takes off out of this pocket, hauls downstream, and it was like dancing on bowling balls, trying to keep up without falling into the river. I'm still not sure how I didn't go in the drink with this one. This fish just kept tugging and digging deep. It refused to give up. Alex has the camera rolling. He's shouting encouragement, but I couldn't hear him because I was just worried that I was going to lose this fish. And then I slowly worked it to the edge into a piece of calmer water. And then Alex, boom, scoops it up with the net. We've got it on video, and it was a wonderful experience. And that just reinforces the sense of accomplishment of catching that fish because it was in a tough spot. I almost went in the drink a couple of times catching it. The Browns really tend to do that to you. Now, that's also a good segue into their reputation, which I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the show, which is that they're extremely, extremely difficult to catch. And this is really part of what gives them their mythical status in fly fishing. I mean, yeah, big rainbows are really cool. A big cutthroat's cool. A big brookie is really cool, but the big browns, they kind of inspire a little bit of awe, don't you think? They really make you stop and think, ooh, that's a big fish. And they look like angry dinosaurs when they get big, too. It's kind of cool. Now, the reason that browns have a reputation for being moody or picky or tough to catch, however you want to describe them, the reason that reputation exists is because brown trout, more than other trout, tend to feed only when there's an active hatch. Now, they'll certainly take other opportunities to eat because they are a predator. And especially if you put a big meal right in front of their face, like a streamer or a nice big stonefly nymph, they're going to eat it. But they've also got a little bit more self-restraint than other trout too. They will wait to feed until there's an active hatch. And that's when they'll spend their energy on snacking the absolute most. And, you know, I as I was doing the show, I kept thinking to myself, man, if I was like a brown trout, I could probably lose these 30 pounds and fit into my waders again. But browns will also feed a lot more readily at low light as well. So early in the morning and late evening can be a great time to target them. But when you combine when they prefer to feed the most with their predisposition to feed only when there's an active hatch, you get a fish that seems very moody because they aren't going to commit to eating and eating and eating and eating unless expending that energy is worth it. So it makes sense when you think about it from that point of view. But that's part of what gives them that reputation of being so tough. Now, they'll still feed during the day. You can catch plenty of brown trout in the middle of the day. My local creek is mostly browns. I catch up midday all the time, but your chances of getting a lot of them or the big one is going to be in those low light periods or when a hatch is going on. It's very similar to hunting elk if you've ever done any elk hunting because, yeah, you'll see elk plenty during the day, but your best chance of seeing a lot of elk and that really big bull that you want to shoot is going to be right at dusk or first thing in the morning. So the browns do deserve their reputation of being a bit tougher to catch just based on how they like to feed and where they like to live, like we mentioned earlier. Between hanging out in the root ball and only eating when it feels like it, yeah, browns are kind of tough. So if browns are tougher to catch, brings up a reasonable question, I think, and that is, how do you go about chasing them? What do you do to catch these critters? Well, you should approach them just like you should any other trout because they are trout. Yes, they're a little pickier, but they're still trout. So approach them just like you would with anything else. They're going to have a diet of primarily aquatic insects for the first few years of their life. So if you're fishing a river that's got a lot of browns in it, you don't need special brown trout flies. And that's a misconception that I hear sometimes where folks will say, well, I want to catch a rainbow or a brookie or a brown or a cutthroat. What fly should I use? Well, it's not the fly. It's where you're fishing that fly. Okay. For example, the green below Flaming Gorge, my favorite river in the world. There's sections of it where it's much more likely that I'm going to catch a rainbow out of that than I will a brown because there's more of that faster water that rainbows prefer. There's more of that habitat that rainbows prefer. I don't change my flies when we get to these spots because I'm fishing flies that represents what's currently available to the fish. I can catch the rainbows, but then when we float through it and we're back into water that's predominantly brown trout habitat, I'll start catching browns again. It's not the fly, it's where you're fishing it. So that really is the best piece of advice that I can give you if you want to catch browns, and especially the big ones, is that you need to target the rivers that have brown trout in them. Now, the only caveat I'll make here with fly selection is that brown trout do tend to be more piscivorous, which I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I always stumble over that one. But that just means they eat more fish. Piscivorous means they'll eat other fish, and they get more piscivorous, especially as they get larger. So they'll eat more and more fish, and they'll eat fewer and fewer insects as they get larger. They'll also eat mice, birds, ducks, basically anything that falls into the water and they can get their mouth around it, they'll go chomp on it. They'll take a bite out of it. They are aggressive sons of guns. Rainbow trout, they'll get that way as they get old. They'll eat other fish as well. Cutthroat will as well, but both rainbows and cutthroat tend to have a more balanced diet of bugs and fish when they get large. The brown trout skew a little bit more towards fish than these other ones. A case in point would be Alex. His personal best fish on a fly rod was a 25.25-inch rainbow trout that he caught on a size 18 midge. So giant rainbow eating a tiny bug. And then I've caught, I think it was a 26 or 27-inch rainbow. I'm not exactly sure on the measurement, but it ate a mysis shrimp. So neither of those really big fish ate streamers. Now, my biggest browns have all come on the big meaty streamer patterns. So fishing streamers in deeper water near the gnarliest structure you can find is going to be your best bet for enticing a larger brown. And remember how I mentioned brown trout eating mice. This is another point I wanted to make. The biggest browns are the ones who are going to eat mice. They've grown to that point where mice make sense to be part of their diet. They're most often going to feed at night at that point. And there is an entire subculture in fly fishing of anglers who want to run out and target big browns at night with mouse flies. And I've actually got two friends who do that, Chris and Brian. They go out and every summer they'll fish at night and they'll go out middle of the night, fish 5 or 6 hours, go to work, sleep for a couple hours, and just repeat that cycle. And there's a lot of fishless nights, but both Chris and Brian have caught 30-inch brown trout on mouse flies at night. And that's probably your best bet at actually catching a 30-inch brown and not having it be luck, is going out at night with some big mouse flies. So that is something you can try if you are so inclined. Let's end this section of the show with a couple other fun facts about brown trout. Just again, make sure we don't forget anything that's important. Their average size, according to the U.S. Forest Service, is about 15 inches. So that's about an average brown here in America. And they can't reproduce until they're 3 years old, and they'll live for about 4 to 6 years. So they don't live terribly long out in the wild. They can be up to 10 years old in the right circumstances, but that is rare. Now, generally speaking, the bigger a fish is, the older it is because it's had more time to grow. But it is really hard to tell just how old a fish is based only on its size, because A fish living in a nutrient-poor river might take all 5 years of its life to grow to 15 inches, whereas a brown living in a big tailwater full of all sorts of good food could grow that big in just 2 years. So it really depends. And then brown trout do change colors and physical appearance when they spawn. Mentioned this earlier. They do spawn in the fall. And the males will go these big, sharp teeth, and they'll have these long hooked jaws that they use to defend their spawning nests, which are called reds. And those big hooked jaws are called kypes. They get incredibly aggressive before spawning, and those teeth are sharp. They will bite you. I've been bitten a couple of times taking flies out of the mouth of brown trout in the fall as they're getting ready to spawn. It's kind of crazy. I come home with my thumbs and my pointer finger all chewed up and looks like I lost a battle with a rose bush or something. Nope, just big brown trout being mean. So that covers it for brown trout. Again, very interesting fish, but don't overthink it either. They like big meals. They tend to eat more and more fish as they get older, and they're going to live in the gnarliest, deepest water. They're going to hang out and be a little bit more temperamental and tougher to catch than other fish, but they're not impossible to fish either. So find a river that's got brown trout. Go out there, put some of this information to the test, and if there's anything interesting that I forgot about brown trout, leave a comment. I'd love to learn more. And with that, folks, thank you so much. We're going to move on to the Q&A section of this week's show.
Nothing is worse than hooking into a big fish only to have your knot break halfway through the fight. Setting up your rod and tying knots can be confusing and frustrating, especially if you're unsure if it's going to work. That's why we put together our Rigs and Knots Pocket Guide. It has instructions and tips on how to set up the most time-tested, proven, reliable fly fishing rigs step by step. So if you want to spend less time tinkering and more time fishing with confidence, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this guide for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a question about fly fishing that you would like answered, please go ahead and send those on in to us. There is a link to do that in the show notes. And often the questions y'all send in become the basis for the open of the show as well. And our first question this week comes to us from Chris from Colorado, who writes in and says, do the flies that come in your starter pack work in Colorado? Chris, no, they don't. They only work in Utah, Montana, California, Oregon, Washington, and the entire East Coast. No, I'm sorry. I couldn't resist making the joke. I'm sorry. Kidding aside, this is a good question. This is a legitimately good question. You're thinking the right way about things. You're thinking, okay, are these flies going to work in my local rivers? Is it all the same? And that's a very good mindset to have when you're approaching fly fishing. And luckily for us, trout flies are generally the same across the whole country. So what will work in the East is going to work in the West to a point, because there will be some variation in local patterns. You've got the Hexagenia mayflies in the Midwest, for example, which we don't have out here in the Rocky Mountains. But then in the Rockies, we've got big old salmon flies that you don't have anywhere else. And then there's Hendricksons out east, where you have a lot more of them than you do out here in the West. But the usual groups of midges, mayflies, caddis, and stoneflies, that base collection will work really well for you just about anywhere. And that's what we based our fly collections on, was what are the trout flies that are going to work 90% of the time in every river, and let's put those in the collection. And then, of course, everywhere you go to fish, you're going to need some specialty flies, some stuff that is specific to your area. So again, you might need those Hexagenia mayflies, or the salmon flies, or the Hendricksons, depending on where you live and what you fish for. So in Colorado, our fly collections are going to give you a great base to start out when you're chasing trout, but you might need to pick up some specialized patterns, and that would really look like some tiny midges, because that is a staple in Colorado. A lot of those fish out there in the tailwaters especially, they really love the tiny midges, the really small blue wings. So you'll need to go a little bit smaller and a little bit specialized in some patterns, but then you'll still have a good base for a lot of your other fishing as well. So again, you're thinking about this correctly, Chris. That's the right mindset to have. And if you'd like to learn more, and if anybody would like to learn more about picking the right fly, no matter where you're at, we've actually got an entire fly selection masterclass dedicated to that topic. I will throw the link to that in the show notes as well. You can go check that thing out. It will take you through everything from identifying what a bug is to picking the right one out of your box. So thanks for that question, Chris. I really appreciate it. Bart from Idaho has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey Spencer, greatly enjoy your podcast and all the VFC crew does to improve fly fishing skills. I have 2 years of fly fishing under my belt. I'm at the blind squirrel level. Even a blind squirrel will find a nut once in a while. Looking forward to applying what I'm learning from your podcast if it ever warms up. It's -1 degree today. I have a question about my leader and tippet. I have a 9-foot 5-weight rod. I use a 7.5-foot leader, tippet ring, and 2 feet of tippet before my first fly as my standard rig. I replace my tippet when it gets 6 inches or shorter. I used my leader all season. This year, I want to focus on dry and dry droppers. What do you think of this leader tippet setup? Should I be using a 9-foot leader and add tippet as it gets shorter? Thanks again." Bart, this is a good question. I like the way you're approaching things here. Personally, you're asking, I don't like tippet rings. I don't use them. I mentioned that in last week's show, I think it was. And especially for dry fly rigs, I just don't like the idea of that metal ring being part of the drift because I don't want it to mess with the drift. I want as little out there as possible when I'm fishing dries or dry droppers. I want as great as a drift as I can get. And I just don't like the idea of the tippet ring potentially interfering with that. Now, I know a lot of folks use tippet rings with their dry flies and do very well with them, and all the more power to them for making that happen. I personally just don't, and that's the reason why. That said, it does sound like your rig is working well for you, so I'm not going to tell you that you need to do it my way or that my way is correct. I'm telling you what I prefer. And honestly, the fish are going to tell you what's correct, right? If you're catching fish, if you're putting them in the net, then you're doing it correctly and don't overthink it too much. But again, I wouldn't say there's a need to change that rig for nymphing, but for dry flies though, I would definitely go with a 9-foot leader instead of a 7.5 footer and then just add tippet as necessary to that leader. I actually like to start out with a 3X or 4X leader myself, and then I will add sections of tippet with blood knots until I get down to the size of tippet that I need for whatever flies I'm fishing that day. I like using that bigger leader as my base because they turn the leaders over better. They just turn everything better over in the wind, but then they can handle bigger flies too. So if I want to switch to a big hopper dropper in the middle of the day, that 3X leader is going to turn that over very well. But then if I need to go over to a smaller caddis for the evening caddis hatch, that 3X leader, again, I can add some extra tippet to it. I've still got the heft of turning it over in the wind, but then I can make those more delicate presentations just by adding some tippet onto the end of it. So I really like the versatility that a heavier leader offers me. And my go-to is actually a 4X. And I'll tie my dry fly just right to the 4X usually. I really only go down to 5X anymore if the fish are just refusing my dry flies, but I start out with 4X just because I like to be able to get the fish in a little bit quicker. It's better for the fish, and you lose fewer flies with 4X than you do with 5X. And I'm just not entirely convinced that really small tippet is always necessary. I try to change my presentation and perfect that before I ever think about changing the tippet size. And then again, I use blood knots when I'm constructing all of my leaders and tying on sections of tippet because it's strong and it's got a nice slim profile on the water. They can be a pain in the butt to learn how to tie. So fair warning with the blood knots, but once you've done a few thousand of them, they're they're a piece of cake at that point. They really do get easier, though, the more that you tie with them. That is what I recommend, but a double or triple surgeons will be just fine as well. Or you can keep using your tippet rings. So if that works for you, then go for it. Do it. But honestly, we could even back out from this and say, are we getting too into the weeds, even talking about specific leader construction? Because your goal as a fly angler is to get a fly in front of a fish and make that look real. So your leader setup should reflect that goal. You want a leader that creates as little drag and as little silhouette on the water as possible to accomplish that goal. So sometimes when you start digging into things this much, it can help to take that step back and think, nope, what's my goal? Put a fly in front of a fish, make it look real. What's the simplest way to accomplish that? And then go with it. So just another thing to think about, but I really appreciate the question. Thank you. Greg from Massachusetts has our next question, writes in and says, thanks for all the information you guys provide. It continues to help me immensely. My question is about those times when you're allowed to and decide to keep a trout for dinner. I haven't been in this situation yet, but are there any best practices to keep in mind? Also, do trout need to be bled, and what's the best way to do this? Greg, thanks for the question. I think this might be the first question like this that we've had on the show. So yeah, thank you for sending this in. I honestly don't remember the last time I kept a trout. It was probably my last serious backpacking trip a few years ago when we were eating fish so that we had to carry less food in on our backs. But trout are great. They taste really good. I'm a big proponent of keeping and eating trout when it makes sense. When the local regulations allow it, you'll always want to check your regulations before you keep trout because there might be rules on how big they have to be or how many you can keep or what specific sections of the river you can even keep them from. So always check those local regs first. But I think it really is important in some ways to have that connection to the fish that we're chasing and trying to catch, just because I found it gave me more respect for the fish when you start harvesting them to eat. And it just helped me elevate how I viewed them a little bit more and want to take even better care of them during catch and release fishing. So that's just, again, my personal experience. I'm not saying that that's what you have to do to gain that, but that's what it did for me. So I do think it's worth trying for everybody. And I think everybody should try trout at least once in their life. It does taste pretty good. And a lot of places that are stocked with fish, like your lakes and your reservoirs, they're often a great place to keep fish from because they'll taste really, really good out of those lakes. And then to be honest, there's a lot of rivers out here in the West that could handle some brown trout harvest to help thin the fish population a little bit and then increase the fish size, because there's a lot of places where there's just so many fish and then there's a limited amount of food as well. Anyways, I generally like to keep trout around the 15-inch mark. That's my benchmark for a good fish. Past that, I don't know that they taste as good. From a lake, you can probably keep them up to 18 to 20 and they'll still taste good in my experience. But again, that's personal preference. So experiment with that on your own. I have found, though, that really big trout, really fat trout, or really long trout, they don't taste as good. I've eaten a few big ones that were just mushy or the taste was off. A lot of that might have to do with diet as well, but the really big ones just don't seem to taste as good. So I really like those 15-inchers. When I do decide to keep trout, the very first thing that I do is make sure I've got a rock handy that I can bash them on the head with. I want to make sure that they go quick and that they don't suffer, and that's the easiest way to do it. It's that same concept that you should use when you go out hunting or harvesting any animal to eat as well. You want to make sure that they don't suffer at all. So make sure that you are appropriately taking care of that. And then once they are dead, I do go ahead and cut the gills. I do that with salmon, with halibut, with any of the fish that I keep. It makes a difference in the taste of the fish. I've noticed that just from not doing it for forever and then doing it. And this is what Greg means when he's talking about does the fish need to be bled, usually cutting the gills, bleeding the fish. That'll just help the flavor, I've found, substantially. And then I'll usually find a stick to use as a stringer, and then I'll haul it home just on the stick. And then I will almost always fillet that fish before grilling it. I like the fillets. I just like eating them that way. And then I throw a little bit of garlic, butter, seasoned salt, and Italian seasoning on it and grill it. And I found that to be a fantastic way to go ahead and eat trout. So thanks for the question, Greg. I appreciate that. Anders from Idaho has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, I've been fishing creeks a lot and was wondering where the fish from those small creeks go in the wintertime. Love the show, by the way. Keep it up." Well, Anders, good question, and thank you. I appreciate it. During the winter, all of the fish will tend to be in the deepest part of the river. So if the river gets too low during the winter or doesn't have enough bug life in the winter, then some fish might leave it entirely and head to a lake if that river is connected to a lake. One of the local rivers here, that actually happens. It's full of lake run fish during the spring and summer because there's so much food in that river in spring and summer, and then they'll move up there to spawn as well, and they'll hang out in the river for a little bit. But during the winter, the flows get so low that there's just not a lot of great habitat for the fish. So they almost all of them move back down to the lake. I think it was something like 70% of that river's trout population actually lives in the lake in the winter and then spends just a few months out of the year in the river. So they will move around to find the right habitat for wintering over. And again, that needs to be a deep, slow area that's protected from predators, but still offers them a lot of food, and then obviously is deep enough that it won't freeze solid, because if it freezes solid, then that's a real problem for the fish. But again, they head for those deep pools because that's where they're going to hang out in the winter so that they can stay away from the predators, have a lot of food, and not spend too much energy eating, because a trout's metabolism slows down immensely during the winter, so they don't eat as much, and therefore they're not going to spend as much energy swimming around. So you'll find all of them in those deeper pools and runs. Again, good question, Anders, and thank you so much for sending it in. And with that, folks, we are going to move on to the Live Real Life moment for this week's show. Every week here at Untangled, we end the show with a story from somebody in the VFC community who's out there living real life and having a blast on the water. We love to see these stories, to hear them, to see your pictures of you guys out there catching fish, just having a great time. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you'd like to submit, there is a link to do that in the show notes. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Alan. Writes in and says, "This is hands down the biggest trout I've ever caught. Mind you, I've been fishing for almost 30 years. I only started fly fishing about a year or so ago. I went 2 to 3 times with some friends and gleaned what I could from watching them and little bits of advice along the way. This year I decided to get serious and of course picked one of the most technical pieces of water I could find close to home. It rhymes with Schmeckers in Colorado on the South Platte. I have been going out on my days off and trying to get things right. I started by throwing away a bunch of money on flies and learning how to cast. Then I found your masterclass on YouTube and the podcast. The way you explain things, it started to make sense. I kept trying, kept following the right fly formula, and would you believe last week I actually got a few strikes. So this week I came back. I listened to the podcast on the way to the river to get my mind right. I took my time looking under rocks to find the right nymph to throw. Tried that for a bit and then sized down to a size 16 Prince nymph with a size 22 Chocolate Thunder tied on below in a double nymph configuration using 5X tippet on a 5X leader. I just wanted to get a fish on. I started roll casting into a riffle with some nice rocks underwater. Suddenly, boom, fish on. Not a huge take, but he was hooked. I started to fight, feeling like I've got a pretty big fish on. We've all been there, only to land a 1/4 pounder with cheese. And then he jumped out of the water. Massive fish. My heart starts racing. A man on the bank says, "Dude, you just hooked into a hog." I know. I fight this fish for about 15 minutes and with the help of my new friend on the bank, got him into the net. Not only was this my first proper fish on a fly rod, but it is the biggest trout I've ever caught. Based on statistics for this stretch of river, I caught a once-in-a-lifetime river monster. I released my trophy after a few quick pictures and watched him swim away, hopefully for someone else to get a similar experience. My best guess on size, based on the size of my net, was a 22-inch fish that weighed 5-ish pounds, maybe more. I was too stoked to guess an accurate weight. An absolute hog by any standards. I have to thank you and the Ventures Flyco crew for the content you create that definitely got me to land my first fish on a fly rod. I'm hooked for life. Hashtag live real life. Well, Alan, congratulations, man. That is so stinking cool. Good for you. That is just those big fish, especially the first big ones that you catch fly fishing. They're special. They get your blood pumping. They get you excited in a way that few other things do. And that is just a fantastic experience. And to catch that on the South Platte, holy cow. That's even more. That might be the whole impressive, or the most impressive part of this whole story, is where you caught that fish. So really good work. I'm really impressed. Great job at telling the story. Thank you again for sharing it with us. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the show this week. Thank you so much for being here with us. It means a lot to us all. And if you could, please rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can reach and help them live real life and have a great time out on the water. And if you'd like to learn anything more about fly fishing, we've got links to all sorts of other content. You can click on them wherever you see them. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water, enjoy yourselves, catch some fish, and live real life.